Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello dear learners, welcome to the session of Managerial Economics. I am Dr. Supriya Jain, working as an assistant professor in the Institute of Business Management at GLA University, Mathura. Let us look at the topics which we have covered yesterday. In our yesterday's session, we have talked particularly about demand forecasting. As we all know, forecasting our demand is very important because it gives answer to the many questions. How much to produce, how we are going to make necessary arrangements required for the production. So, for all that reason, we have understood what demand forecasting is, and we have also seen before we go ahead with demand forecasting, we need to understand what level of forecasting we are going with, right. So, the categorization first we do for demand forecasting based on the level. It can be done at individual level, at firm level, industry level, or it can be done at economic level. So, those different levels we have discussed, and whatever the level we are choosing, accordingly we will be choosing our methodology. Then it can be done for the time period also. Before you forecast the demand, you should be clear with the time period, whether you are forecasting the demand for the longer period of time or you are forecasting it for a shorter period of time. Usually the year up to 2 years would be considered to be a shorter period of forecasting, and besides that, if you are forecasting, then it would be considered to be a long term forecasting. And then we have also seen the nature of goods plays a very important role in demand forecasting consideration. For what type of commodity are you forecasting, whether your product is of capital nature or it is a consumer good. So, again your target audience will be different, and the opinion and the interview and the questions which you are going to ask from those people will be different, right. Thereafter, we have seen the significance, that is the importance of demand forecasting. Yes, it is very important because demand forecasting will help the managers to make effective and successful planning for the business. They can make their productions according to the demand to overcome the situation of overproduction and underproduction, right. Firm can make necessary arrangements of finance also. They can use various marketing or promotional strategies to enhance the demand of the product in the market. It can also help in evaluating the performance. So, all these things are required. For all these things, demand forecasting is being required, right. Thereafter, we have also seen the criterias, the important aspects which are need to be taken into consideration while choosing the method for the demand forecasting. Like what is more important for you, right. Accuracy, the results which you are going to get from that method, right. How much that method is economical, what kind of cost it is going to involve, maintenance of timeliness, right. Whether you will be able to get your results within time or not, how much you can rely on the results, right. How much flexibility that method is going to provide you, because it is going to be done for the future and you never know what kind of changes you need to incorporate. So, how flexible it is, right. So, these were the aspects which you need to take into consideration before you choose any demand forecasting method. And then we have seen these steps, how we start with this demand forecasting process, right. How we are going to decide our objective first, and we need to analyze the different determinants of the demand, what is the nature of the commodity, then we need to find out the right method of selecting this demand forecasting, and the results which we are getting out of it, we need to interpret those results, right. So, there are certain steps which you need to follow to forecast the demand of your commodity. And then we have talked about the method, the most important aspect through which we can forecast the demand. So, here we have talked about qualitative and quantitative methods for demand forecasting, and the qualitative methods are usually those methods which are being taken up to forecast the demand for the products which are new to the market or where we do not have the past data available to us, and usually the qualitative methods are used for forecasting the demand for the shorter period of time, whereas quantitative methods are those methods which are more suitable and which are more which gives you better results. Yes, for sure, because they are based on some tools and techniques, right. And here we analyze those things in a mathematical consideration. okay, and here we usually forecast the demand for the longer period and the products which are already there in the market, for which we are having the time series data available to us. For that reason, the results are also better drawn with this quantitative methods, right. And lastly, we have seen the limitations of demand forecasting. While conducting or while forecasting the demand, there are certain problems which a firm goes through, like time is again one consideration, money is a consideration, like we could take expert advice, but we do not find those expertise people in our market, right. We are not able to get that much of data which has been required for the forecasting of demand. So, there are different kind of problems an organization has to face while forecasting the demand. So, those were discussed in our previous lecture. So, completely we can say we have talked about demand forecasting, starting with what it is and what problems we are facing while forecasting the demand. So, now let us start with our today's lecture, and here in this lecture we are going to talk about consumer preferences and choices, right. How do consumer make out their choices and how they are revealing their preferences. So, that is what we are going to cover in our today's lecture, and let us look at the learning objective of our session. So, initially you will be introduced to the crux of consumer behavior, because as we know, economics is a study of how consumer behave, right, because it is very important to know how consumer are behaving and how they are making their decisions, because ultimately everything in the economy based on consumer behavior, because it is a social science. So, how consumer will behave, what choices are they making and what preferences are they giving to the products, and this will also help you to explain the nuances of utility analysis, right, because consumer whatever the purchase they are making, they need to get the satisfaction out of it, because if they are not getting that satisfaction, they will not purchase that commodity, right. So, utility is basically the power of making the consumer satisfied, how much they are being satisfied with that commodity. So, that nuances of utility analysis you will be able to understand here with the concept of marginal utility, what is total utility, and here we will also talk about law of diminishing marginal utility as well as law of equi marginal utility. Thereafter, in this lecture you will be able to differentiate between cardinal and ordinal utility. These are the two important measures through which we can measure the utility concept, which are given by different economists. So, you will get to know the difference between cardinal and ordinal utility to analyze the consumer behavior. Thereafter, we will talk about consumer equilibrium. Consumer equilibrium, like we have talked about market equilibrium. Equilibrium is a state of balance. When market is in equilibrium, we say that demand and supply is equals, right. When aggregate demand of the economy is equals to the aggregate supply, then we say that our economy is in equilibrium. So, same here we will talk about the consumer equilibrium, how consumer will reach up to the state of their equilibrium position, where their income and the utility they are deriving out of the consumption of all the commodities will be same. So, that consumer equilibrium we will be discussing here, and we will also talk about the budget constraint, because we have already understood that resources are limited. So, here the budget, the income of a person is a constraint, is a limited thing. Accordingly, we are going to divide our consumption of commodities, so as maximum utility can be derived out of it. And lastly, you will be able to understand the concept of revealed preference theory. Revealed preference theory will help you to understand how consumer will reveal their preferences, and based on this theory, how are they making their choices. So, these will be the learning objective of our today's session. So, let us begin with the very first point, where we are going to understand the consumer choices. Now, to understand the consumer choices, as you know that consumer have a different kind of taste and preferences, and to understand the taste and preferences of the consumer, we have to make certain assumptions. Like in economics, we have various laws, okay, we have various theories, but these theories are only applicable with certain assumptions. So, again, for understanding the consumer choice and to understand the relative aspect of this cardinal, ordinal as well as revealed preference theory, you need to understand these 3 points very clearly, right. So, the very first point here is talking about completeness. right. What does that mean? See, completeness is one assumption which we are making, that the consumer is clear about their choices, right. Consumer is consistent about their choices. That means if there are two products, suppose we have two products, one is product A and the other one is product B, and if a consumer is preferring product A over B, right. So, consumer is preferring product A and product A over B, that means the consumer will always prefer product A over B, or consumer prefer product B over A. So, consumer is basically consistent in their choices, and whatever the choices they are making, they are having a complete clarity of that choice, that what product they are preferring. Are they preferring A over B, or they are preferring B over A, or the consumer is indifferent between these two products, either A or B, right. There is no difference between the consumption of commodity A or commodity B. Consumer is indifferent among these two consumption of commodities, or a consumer have a clarity about whether the consumer is going to prefer A over B or B over A, right. So, this is what basically this assumption says, which is known as completeness, right, or this can also be called as consistent. Consumer is always consistent about making their choices. Now, coming to the second assumption, we have this transitivity. Now, transitivity is just a step ahead of this assumption, where we are saying that if a consumer is preferring A over B, right, and is also preferring B over C, right. So, here we are taking three commodities. If a consumer is preferring A over B and B over C, then if a consumer has to make a choice between A and C, then definitely they will prefer A over C, right. So, this is what transitivity says. Transitivity says consumer are clear with their preferences, they are having this consistency that which product they are preferring over the another product, and they keep their preferences consistent, and accordingly only they are behaving. So, these are some assumptions which we are trying to understand to know the behavior pattern of a consumer, what behavior they are showing. Okay. So, first is completeness, where we have seen the relationship between two commodities, which commodity consumer is preferring, or if the consumer is indifferent among these two commodities, then next principle is going to applied similarly, right. And if we have three commodities where A is being preferred over B and B is being preferred over C, then in that case, if a consumer has to make a choice between A and C, then definitely consumer will prefer A. Or you can say that if a consumer is indifferent between A and B and C, then if there is a choice between A and C, then consumer will be indifferent between A and C. He can choose either A or he can choose either B, right. So, these are the assumption for the consumer behavior we are making here. Now, look at the third assumptions we have written here, that is non-satiation, right. What does that mean, non-satiation? As a consumer, right, consumer is a person who is never ever satisfied, right. They always look for more and more. If something of good is better, then more of that particular commodity is much better, right. So, if you are having something in quantity 1 and somebody is offering you the another quantity, definitely you will be happy to have this, because a consumer is having that kind of spirit where they are never satisfied and they are always looking for more and more of the things, right. They will always prefer if there is a choice between two consumption basket of one pizza and two pizza, then definitely consumer will prefer to have two pizzas, right. Okay. So, this is how we try to understand the consumer choices based on these assumptions, and these assumptions are very important for our further discussions of the concept like ordinal utility and revealed preference theory. So, now let us move ahead to understand the concept of utility, right. How consumer are making choices and how they are behaving, those assumptions we have studied. Now, what is meant by utility? Like I said, utility is a satisfaction given to the person, right. The satisfaction they are deriving out of the consumption of any commodity is known as utility. This basically notion given by Jeremy Bentham, and he has coined this term utility, and it is the satisfaction of a consumer that derives out of the consumption of a commodity, right. Or you can say that it is an attribute of a commodity to satisfy or satiate, right. You can also call it as a satiation or the satisfaction which a consumer is drawing out of the consumption of that commodity. So, that is how we define the concept of utility. Now, we can also frame out this utility function, right, like we have demand function, we have schedule function, like utility is function of what, right. So, if we are establishing this mathematically, we can say that utility is a function of the commodities which you are consuming, right. So, here we have written utility is the function of M1, N1 and R1, and what is this M1? M1 is the quantity of commodity M, quantity of commodity N is the N1 and quantity of commodity R is the R1, right. Whatever the quantity you have consumed of those commodities, it is the combination of those commodities after consuming them, what utility you have derived out of it. Here you can expressing it in terms of utility function, right. So, utility function can be written like this based on the different consumption of goods. Okay. Now, moving ahead, you can see that a rational consumer as we all know is a person who is always making a choice between the cost and the benefit, right, and is also making a decision where benefits are higher than the cost. So, being a rational consumer, we always aims at maximizing our utility from the consumption of different commodities subject to the budget constraint. Now, you can see here we are talking about actually the thing which we have started initially with the limited resources, how we are going to satisfy our maximum needs and wants. So, limited resource here is the income, right, the budget which we are having. So, how we are going to utilize our income or how we are distributing this income to the consumption of different commodities where we would be able to satisfy our maximum needs and wants, and this we can do when we are behaving rationally, we are making rational decisions, analyzing each and every aspect of it and finding it out where we can have a maximum satisfaction, right. So, looking ahead, now let us look at the concept of utility more clearly with these two theories. One is called as cardinal utility and the other one is called as ordinal utility, right. These are the two important theories which are given in this utility consideration for its calculation. So, we will start first with this cardinal utility. This cardinal utility concept is given by Alfred Marshall, right. He is the person who has understood this concept and bring to our notice that utility can be measured. As per Alfred Marshall, cardinal utility says that we can assign numbers of util to any commodity. Whatever commodity we are consuming, right, we can find out what kind of satisfaction we are deriving out of it. Okay, what utility we have received out of the consumption of that commodity, and that utility can be expressed in unit, and the unit for measuring that is known as utils. Okay, like we have other measurement units, like we have kilogram, like we have weight, right, we can measure weight in kilograms. Same way utility can be measured in the unit called as utils, right. So, further Marshall says that utility is additive, right, you can also add the utility. It is not that only you can find out the utility in numbers, but it can also be added. Like for example, here is a person, right, looking for a particular consumer. If a consumer has consumed banana, right, and this banana gives him the satisfaction of 2 utils, right, and he has also taken mango and this mango gives him the satisfaction of 3 utils. So, altogetherly the total utility of this person will be equals to 5 utils, 3 plus 2. What means we have added the utilities of these two products altogetherly and we have calculated the total utility of this consumer with the consumption of these two commodities for banana and mango, right. So, this is what is cardinal concept telling us that cardinal utility says that utility can be measured and the measuring unit of utility known as util, not only we can measure it, but yes, we can also add it to find out the total utility of the consumer, and this concept is given by Alfred Marshall, and that is why this is also called as Marshallian theory, right. Now, looking further to the concept of total and marginal utility, what is meant by total utility and what is meant by marginal utility. Total utility you can find out very easily. The total utility which a person is deriving out of the consumption of any commodity, and the aspect of total utility say as and when we keep on consuming any identity, any commodity, the utility increases, but yes, it increases up to a point, but thereafter the utility also stop increases, but it will start decreasing. That I will make you understand with different laws which we are going to take up further in this lecture as well. But for now you need to understand that total utility refers to the sum total of utility levels out of each unit of the commodity, whatever the unit of commodity you have consumed, right, the total utility you have reached with the consumption within a given period of time would be considered to be as in total utility. Whereas marginal utility is, the marginal utility is called as the total unit of one additional unit, right. The marginal utility you will be able to calculate one additional unit. Suppose you have taken one unit and then after one unit of that commodity, when you have taken the second unit, okay, so the difference between the utility of first unit and the second unit would be considered to be as in marginal utility, right. What extra utility you are going to get with the addition of one more unit would be considered as in marginal utility. And here we have the ways of calculating this marginal utility. The first way would be marginal utility is equals to total utility of n commodity minus total utility of n minus 1, means one additional unit which you have taken up, right. If you will deduct it from that, that would be your marginal utility, right. And this is the another way of calculating, this is the another formula written to calculate the marginal utility itself, where we are saying change in total utility, right. Whatever the change is taking place in the total utility divided by the change in quantity, right. Then also you will be able to calculate marginal utility. Now, how we are going to understand this concept of total and marginal utility more clearly? Let us look at the law where we are going to talk about law of diminishing marginal utility. This law of diminishing marginal utility says that as and when we keep on consuming any commodity, the marginal utility which we derive out of the consumption keeps on decreasing, right. So, law of diminishing marginal utility says marginal utility of every successive unit consumed goes on decreasing, and this is explained with a single commodity only. See, we are talking about cardinal concept of utility, and as per the Marshall, cardinal utility of cardinal concept of utility says that we can measure the utility, and to further understand this concept we have two laws basically. One is law of diminishing marginal utility which we are talking right now, and after this we will talk about the another law which is called as law of equi marginal utility. So, this basically law of diminishing marginal utility is applicable for the consumption of one commodity at a time, right. So, if you look at the table how we are expressing this diminishing marginal utility as well as total utility, here we have three columns. In the first column we are talking about the cup of teas consumed per day, that is the quantity given here, and here in the second column we have total utilities, and here we have in the third column the marginal utility, and you can look at the formula. We can calculate it by change in the total utility upon change in the quantity. So, when a person consumes 1 cup of tea, the total utility derived after the consumption is 12 units, right, but which is measured in utils. It is already written here, the measurement unit of utility is utils, and the marginal utility will be same in the very first case. Okay. So, marginal utility and total utility will be same in the very first case, but as and when a consumer keeps on increasing the quantity of this commodity, the consumption of cup of a tea, right, you can see that total utility is increasing, right, but at the point 6 you can see the total utility here is not increasing anymore, rather it has started declining. Whereas marginal utility in each successive case is decreasing. Initially it was 10 utils, then 10, then 8, then 6 and so on. But if you are not continue studying this, you can see that marginal utility can also be negative, right. So, it is actually not advisable to consume the commodity up to the after the point where it is not giving you any more satisfaction. So, it is always advisable for the person to have up to this much of quantity of this consumption of tea, because adding more to it will not give any kind of a utility for that commodity, right. So, if we will draw the graph of these two total utility and marginal utility, we can see this is how we relate it. The first one is showing you the expression of total utility, right. So, here the total utility you can see initially it has increased, but after a point reached here it started declining, right. So, this is basically the satiation quantity which is written here. Beyond this point person should not consume that commodity, whereas the marginal utility curve is a declining curve which represent that it declines, it keeps on decreasing as and when more and more commodities are being consumed for that commodity. Okay. And if you will continue the consumption, it will reach to the negative as well, right, which is again not a thing to do, or go ahead with the consumption of that commodity, right. So, if we look at the law of diminishing marginal utility assumption, this law what we are talking right now is again based on certain assumptions, and without this assumption this law will not work, right. So, what we are saying, the first point says the unit of consumption must be a standard one. That means the commodity which we are consuming, the cup or the size of a cup should remain the same. It should not be like if one sip of tea a person is taking, right. If we are calculating only the one sip of tea, then it will not draw a right conclusion. We are talking about a cup of a tea which is of a standard size, neither too short nor too big, right. So, it should be of a standard one, then only the utility will decline. Consumption must be continuous. This is again important. Whatever you are consuming, it should be consumed on a continuous basis, because if you are making delay in your consumption, or if you are taking that consumption after an interval, right, then definitely its utility will not diminish. That consumption need to be taken at a point of a time. Multiple units of commodity should be consumed. This law is applicable only on the consumption of those commodities which can be consumed multiply at a time, right. If we talk about durable goods, right, this law is not going to applicable on the durable goods, because if you have purchased a car, you are not going to purchase a car at the same time, another car, or maybe the car next day, right. It is a durable good, right, whereas non-durable goods like eatables which you can consume altogetherly, which are of recurring nature, this law is applicable to those goods only. Then next we are saying that the taste and preference of the consumer should also remain unchanged. Yes, for sure, if you are talking about some commodity and a person is consuming that commodity, the consumer keeps on consuming that commodity. And see, we have made that assumption earlier only, that consumer are consistent in their choices. There is a completeness, there is a clarity of choices of commodities which they are going to make, and that remains same. It should not be changed. If it is suddenly going to change, then again that concept is difficult for us to understand. And lastly, we are saying that good should be a normal good, it should not be an addictive good, because in case of addictive goods might be possible that their utility will not decline, because consumer is addictive to that commodity. So, these applications will not be possible in case of addictive goods, right. So, here are the assumptions of law of diminishing marginal utility. So, basically with this law we have understood how we can measure the utility of any commodity which a consumer is consuming, and we have seen that we can easily calculate it in terms of utils in the measurement unit which is been given by Alfred Marshall. But to make it clear to every one of you that this law of diminishing marginal utility is applicable for only one commodity at a time, right. But if you look at in practical sense, there are no people who are consuming only one commodity at a time. So, people consume different commodities at the same time. So, how are we going to calculate the utility derived out of those commodities which they are consuming together? So, for that we need to understand law of equi marginal utility. Law of diminishing marginal utility will work only to understand the utility or derived out of the consumption of a single commodity, but in real life consumer buys multiple commodities at the same time to satisfy their diverse wants, right. So, for that we talk about law of equi-marginal utility, and law of equi-marginal utility is basically the law which helps you how you are going to distribute your available income in the consumption of different commodities, where the marginal utility which you are going to derive at the end from the consumption of different commodities will remain same, right. If you guys remember, we have talked about the equi-marginal principle, right. At that time also I have discussed it with every one of you. This law of equi-marginal principle works in different aspects. If we talk about from the consumer point of view, then we look for the marginal utility which a consumer is deriving out of the distribution of income in the consumption of different commodities, whereas from the producer side we have seen the marginal productivity derived out of the allocation of different activities or allocation of resources in different activities, right. So, here as per the law of equi-marginal utility, marginal utility of all commodities should be equal. Suppose there is a commodity A, B and C, and a person has a given income, right. So, how a person is going to distribute his income for the consumption of these three commodities, so that the marginal utility of good 1 should be equals to the marginal utility of good 2 should be equals to the marginal utility of all the goods which a person is consuming at the same time, right. So, utility is the last unit consumed, right. Utility from the last unit consumed is the marginal utility. The last unit which you are going to consume for that commodity would be considered as an marginal utility, and a rational consumer, a person who behaves rationally, will always try to maximize their total utility, so that at the end they will be satisfied. Okay. At the end they can say that they have distributed their income in a proportion where they are getting the equal satisfaction out of the consumption of each and every commodity, right. So, this is how we understood this cardinal concept, right, where we have seen that utility can be measured in terms of utils. For one commodity we have studied it through the law of diminishing marginal utility, whereas for the multiple units, because in real life consumer consume multiple units at the same time. So, this we have understood with the law of equi-marginal utility, how people can distribute their income to derive the maximum satisfaction, where they need to calculate the marginal utility they are going to derive out of the consumption of different commodities should remain same at the end. But for the practical reasons, we can say that the concept given by Alfred Marshall is not applicable, right. It is very difficult, like how much satisfaction if I am consuming any commodity, and if you will ask me what number of utils or what define the utils of the satisfaction you have derived out of the consumption of that commodity is really very difficult for me to tell, right, and for every one of us. Okay. So, this concept is not very much applicable and practical. So, because of that we have the another concept which is given by J.R.D. Hicks and R.G.D. Allen, right. According to them, they says that utility cannot be measured in numbers, utility cannot be measured in utils, but we can only give ordinal ranking to the consumption of commodities we are consuming. We can rank them in order, right. If they are 2-3 products A, B and C, we can give the ranking that A is being preferred more than B or B is preferred more over C, right. We are not able to tell exactly what kind of utility we are going to derive out of the consumption of these commodities, but yes, we can give our preferences, we can give our choices, right, or we can give our ranking to it in terms of the order, right. That is why we call it as an ordinal utility, and this concept is given by Hicks and Allen. It is a team of an husband and wife. They studied it and they says that it is a more applicable way of calculating the utility. Okay. So, ordinal utility concept says that utility cannot be measured, but can be ranked in comparison with one another. Okay. We can only make a comparison, right. So, modern economist holds that
utility being a psychological phenomenon. See, this is the satisfaction which you are getting psychologically. You cannot say anybody like this much of satisfaction you have received out of the consumption of that commodity. Yes, definitely you can feel it, right. So, that is why we can say that this is a psychological phenomenon, cannot be measured quantitatively, theoretically as well as conceptually. And this way the measure of utility is ordinal rather than the cardinal, and it is qualitative, which is based on the ranking of preference for the commodities. Like for example, suppose a person prefers tea to coffee and coffee to milk. That means he or she can subjectively tell that his or her preference would be tea over coffee and coffee over milk. Like I told you earlier, we have seen the assumption of transitivity as well as completeness. Consumer are consistent and clear with their choices, and whatever the choices they are making it very clearly, and they can give their ranking or preferences on that basis, right. So, indifference curve is basically defined as a locus of point on the graph, each representing a different combination of two substitute goods. So, for understanding this ordinal concept, we are talking about this indifference curve analysis, where we are going to find out the combination of different commodities. Here we are not finding out utility in terms of utils, but we are preferring our commodities, what combination of commodities we are going to consume, right. So, here we have substitute goods, and we make a combination of these two goods which yields the same utility or the same level of satisfaction to the customer. So, the combination of goods gives the equal satisfaction. Suppose this is the curve, here we have on the x axis we have product x, and we have on the y axis product y. So, here we have this indifference curve, where we can use the different combinations of the commodities. Either we can have this much of x and this much of y and x, and then again this is the combination we can use between these two commodities. So, all these points, these are the points which we are defining, right, that these provides the equal kind of a satisfaction. Either we are talking about point A, B, C or D. All these points are giving the same satisfaction to the consumer with the different combination of these two commodities, where we have commodity X and commodity Y, right. So, therefore, what we are saying, the consumer is indifferent between any two combinations of these two goods when it comes to making a choice between them, right. A person can increase the choice or the commodity A over B or X over B, but the satisfaction which they are going to derive out of the combination of those commodities will be same at the end. So, sometimes we also call this curve as an iso-utility curve, which means equal utility you are deriving with the combination of different commodity. So, this indifference curve can also be named as iso-utility curve, and iso means equal. So, again this is how we are representing this indifference curve, which is in short called as IC curve, right. See, on the x axis we have here food, and here we have clothes. So, we are using these different combinations of A, B, C and D. We are choosing of course any one combination, but these are the points to make you understand. So, if we are increasing the consumption of clothes, then definitely we are reducing our consumption of food, because we have a given constraint, that is of a budget, that is of a income of a consumer, right. So, with that given constraint, you can choose the different combination. If you are increasing one consumption of one commodity, in that case you are decreasing the consumption of the another commodity, right. But you are keeping this into your consideration, the satisfactions which you are going to derive out of the consumption of these two commodities will remain same. So, each point on the indifference curve represents a consumption basket having a combination of two commodities which a consumer is going to consume. To understand this IC curve, we have different properties of indifference curve, and how this indifference curve work. Let us look at this. So, very first property says that indifference curve slopes downwards to the right, which means that the slope of indifference curve will be downward and it will always be towards right. Why? It happens because we are choosing the different combinations of the commodity, and to have more of one commodity we are sacrificing the another. definitely in terms of utility we are not making that sacrifice, okay, but yes, to have more of one commodity we are reducing the consumption of another commodity. So, that is why this curve will always be downward sloping. So, what we are saying that it implies that curve has a negative slope, and the property assumes of non-satiation, which refers that the consumer is never satisfied and prefer to have more of goods to less of it, right. Being a rational person, being a human being rather, you can say, we all are non-satisfied people, we always look for more, and this is how we grow actually, right. So, indifferent curves being downward sloping implies two things, whereas follows, either the two goods are substitute of each other, or as quantity of one good increases, the quantity of other good decreases. So, the consumer says that they stays at the same level of satisfaction. Okay. So, this is the very first property of indifference curve. Now, looking at the second property, we are saying that indifference curve will always be convex to the origin, right. This is the origin and this is the shape which we called it as an convex, right. If the shape of the curve would have been like this, then we call it as an concave, but this indifference curve is convex in the shape, and this is because these two goods which we are representing on the x and the y axis known to have they are substitute of each other, and because of this marginal rate of substitution, because we are substituting one product with the another product. So, that is why the shape which we are going to get on the indifference curve will be of convex, right. So, because x product is being substituted for the y product. Then the third property says that indifference curve cannot intersect each other. Now, this is again important, right. You can see that indifferent curve will always be parallel to each other, but there will be a no chance where consumer is going to cut this curve. And why this happens? Because of those assumptions which we have started earlier, where we have seen that consumer is clear and consistent with their choices. They have a clear understanding that if they are preferring A over B or B over A, their preference will remain same or they will be indifferent among these two products. Their choices and their taste and preferences are not going to change anywhere in between, and that is why these two curves will not coincide with each other, or they will not intersect with each other, right. So, this implies only one indifference curve can pass through a point in the indifference map if two commodities intersect each other, which is impossible actually, because we see that the two combination of good yields the different level of satisfaction, or the two combination of goods will yield the same satisfaction, right. So, we have that clarity that how we are making our choices and how we are clear with whatever the combination we are choosing, we are going to go ahead with those combination to derive the maximum satisfaction out of it, and that is why the curves will never intersect with each other. Moving to the next property of indifference curve, we are saying that higher indifference curve will represent higher level of satisfaction. That is again true. The indifferent curve, these are the IC curves which are moving in the upper direction. So, here this is IC1, this is IC2 and this is IC3. So, what does it means? It means that higher our indifference curve will be, because here we are having the combination of these two commodities and this much of quantity we can have for good X and for good Y. But yes, of course, if we move and take out the combination on IC2, then definitely more of these goods will be there, right. So, and as we have seen that consumers are non-satisfied, right, they always look for more and more. So, their utility will be higher if they are consuming more of good X and more of good Y. So, their combinations on the IC curve will give them higher utility as and when we move or draw the higher utility curve, right. So, these are the most important properties of indifference curve, and this indifference curve help us to understand the concept of ordinal utility given by Allen and Hicks, which says that utility cannot be measured in numbers, but yes, ranking can be given, the preferences can be given, keeping into consideration the total utility which we are deriving out of the consumption of these commodities. Now, moving ahead, we have special types of indifference curve. These were the properties which we have talked about, the standard indifferent curves, but there are different situations, there are different commodities available. So, we have some special categories of indifference curve. So, let us look at the first category where we have the indifference curve for the goods which are perfect substitute of each other, right. If the goods are perfect substitute of each other, in that case our indifference curve will be downward sloping, but this downward sloping curve will be a linear curve. Till now we have seen that indifference curve is in the form of a curve, but if two commodities say x and y, right, we have two commodities x and y and we are having 1 unit of commodity x and we are having 10 units of commodity y, right, irrespective of the number we are consuming, but the satisfaction which we are getting out of the consumption of these two combination is the same satisfaction we are going to get if we are having one commodity x and if we are having 10 commodities of y, but our satisfaction will be same because these two are being considered to be a perfect substitute of each other. So, what we are saying, if we are increasing one commodity of 1 unit of x and we are reducing 2 units of y, which makes it as a 8 and which increases up to 2. So, again we are saying that we are substituting product x with the y, or we are substituting product x y with the x by reducing the 2 units, but here the satisfaction which we are getting will be same. So, same case we are saying again, if we want to add 1 unit to this x which makes it 3 and we reduces the 2 units of y which makes it number 6, right. So, you can see the sacrifice which you are making here is consistent, right, is every time 2. To increase 1 unit of x, you are always increasing the 2 units of y, right. So, here you can see the substitution is consistent and that is why this indifference curve will be straight line, which is a linear downward sloping in case of perfect substitute, right. Earlier in this case also we are substituting when we have talked about indifference curve, but they were not the perfect substitute. The substitution which we are doing was not consistent, right. But here in this case we are substituting one commodity with the another commodity in a consistent manner. That is why the indifference curve shape will be linear and downward sloping. Moving ahead, we have we can also draw this indifference curve for the perfect complements. If suppose the goods are perfect complements to each other and the complementary goods are those goods which creates a joint demand, right. So, for that the indifference curve will look like this, which will be of right angled. Again we have here on the x axis the right pair of shoe and we have here the left pair of shoe, right. If we have equal number of right pair and left pair of shoes, then only we will be able to satisfy. If we have one pair of left shoe and we have two pair of left shoe, right shoe, then the another pair of right shoe will be of no use because we do not have a another pair of a left shoe. Okay. So, here if we are talking about see, let me show you this clearly. We have left shoe and we have right shoe. If we have two pair of left shoes and we have two right shoes, then this will give us say the utility x. Okay. But if we increase one left shoe and our right shoe numbers remains the same. So, our utility is going to increase? No, our utility still remain the same because this one pair of left shoe is of no use, right. Even if we say that we have two pair of right shoes and we have increased one number of right shoe, again the utility here we are going to get is equal. The utility will only increase when we are going to increase both of them. Suppose we have added one shoe here for the left and we have also added one shoe here for our right, right. So, then the utility will go up, otherwise it will remain same. So, in this case when the products are complementary to each other, our indifference curve would be of right angle, right. Then yes, we have indifference curve for the bad situations also. Now, which conditions are being called as bad conditions? See, we have different combinations of commodities. Okay, sometimes you are going for something. Suppose if you are going to talk about starting a business, right, starting up a business with an objective of earning profit. Yes, okay, you start up the business activity and you start it up, you take all these resources, you invest your capital with the objective of earning profit, but with that there is always a association of risk because it is always uncertain, it is always risky. There might be a possibility that you might earn losses rather than earning profit. So, the effect and you cannot make a choice between two, right? You have to go ahead with it, right? It is not possible that you only think of earning profit and you ignore this aspect of risk involved into it. So, that comes along with it. Okay. So, if you are planning to construct a dam, right, you want to plan or you want to construct a dam, but for the construction of dam, the kind of a pollution it is going to create, that is something which we have to accept with it. Okay. So, those conditions are called as a bad conditions because they are always being associated with it and we cannot make a choice among any one of them. So, in that case our indifference curve will be upward sloping, because here this represents the bad conditions, right, where they are saying that we have to go ahead with the combinations of these two goods together and we cannot make a choice between one, right. So, this is about your indifference curve, where we have seen the properties, what it is and what are the different situations and how this indifference curve will be drawn. Now, moving to the next heading, where we have consumers' income, right, because it is again very important to understand the utility concept with the available income to the consumer, right, because whatever the spending they are going to make, whatever the budget they are going to make, that is based on the income of a consumer. So, for consumer income, we are going to understand here about the budget constraint, the income which is given, the resource which is limited, and with that limited resource a consumer need to satisfy their maximum needs and wants. Okay. So, budget constraint includes the income of a consumer and the price of the commodities in the consumption basket, because these are the only two things which can affect the demand of any commodity. If the consumer is increasing, then only they can increase their demand, or if the price of commodity decreases, right. In law of demand also we have studied, we have also talked about the reasons behind law of demand, which was called as income effect. Here the income of a consumer is not increasing, right, keeping the same income of a person. If a price of commodity decreases, then also the purchasing power of a person increases. So, this budget constraint is going to talk about two things. One is the income of the consumer and the next is the prices of the commodity, what effect it is going to create on the consumption basket. So, here with this graph we are trying to understand this. This given line is basically the budget line. Okay, this is the budget line of a consumer and this area is basically the area which is unaffordable, because this is the income given, right. Whatever a person can buy or whatever the combination a person can make for the consumption of different commodities can be made within this area. Okay, this is affordable area. Okay, different commodities you can ask at different combination of this area, or at this point budget line also you can draw different combinations, but beyond this line, okay, as because this is an unaffordable area, you do not have resources with you, you do not have that much of income. So, you cannot make any combination beyond this point. So, for a consumer it is important for them to understand how they are going to make their combination of different commodities based on that budget line. Now, this budget lines also shift upward, it can shift downward also, or there can be a movement which are called as swelling, right. So, like I said, budget line is constrained with the change in income and change in price of a consumer. So, it is very simple to understand, whenever the income of a consumer changes, definitely when the income will increase, the budget line will shift towards right. Okay, that will help you to increase your feasible area or the affordable area, or you can consume more of the commodity. And if the income of a consumer reduces, then this budget line will shift backward. Okay, so, with the change in the income, it is easy for you to understand that with the change in income, if income increases, the budget line will shift towards right, and if the income decreases, the budget line will shift towards left. Whereas, if you talk about the change in prices, how the change in price will affect this budget line, right. Suppose the income remains the same, but if the price of this y and the price of this y commodity also remains same, but the price of this x commodity reduces, say for reason, okay, this price of x commodity reduces, being the income of a person same as well as the price of y commodity also being the same, but now you can see this consumer can demand more of this x commodity because the purchasing power has reduced because of the reduction in the price of this commodity, right. So, this movement on the budget line would be known as swelling movement, where a purchasing power of a person can also increase the consumption of that commodity, keeping their income same, right. So, I hope this shifts in budget lines are also clear to every one of you. And then we have this consumer equilibrium, right. What is meant by consumer equilibrium? At what point consumer is going to attain this equilibrium position, right. As we have already talked about the budget line, so given constraint is clear to all. Now, let us look at this consumer equilibrium, where we are saying that consumer equilibrium is at point where the budget line is tangent, right. Tangent means where it is going to touch, okay. Tangent means the point where it is going to touch the budget line to the highest attainable indifference curve by the consumer, subject to the budget constraint, right. So, budget constraint will always be there. So, how consumer is going to touch that line, and they will be able to get their maximum satisfaction. So, as we know that consumer behave rationally and will always aim to maximize their utility with the given money and the price of goods in the consumption basket. So, consumer will always try to utilize their maximum satisfaction, or to have the maximum satisfaction with the given income for the given price of the commodity. So, this is how we basically understand this consumer equilibrium. You can see on the x axis we have good x and then we have good y, and this is our budget line. The straight line which is drawn here is called as the budget line of a person, and this again is a feasible area where you can make the different combinations of the commodity, as well as on the budget line also you have different combination, like for R, S, Q, T, H. These are the different points shown for the different combinations of the product, and these are the IC curves which are beyond this feasible area. So, as we have seen, higher the IC curve, higher will be the utility, but the IC curve beyond the budget line will be of no use, because you can't afford it, right. So, here the consumer will be at equilibrium on this point Q, right, because if you will either choose like I said in the definition also, if you are going to touch this budget line, you are making the combination where you are able to touch this budget line, there you will be able to get the maximum satisfaction. But if you are going to choose this R point, here you are having more of the good X, but you are having the lesser of good you are having more of commodity Y, but you are having the lesser of good X. With this point S also the same thing happening. Whereas, for with these points T and H also you are having more of one commodity, but a lesser of the another commodity. But at the point Q you can see that consumer is able to attain the maximum satisfaction, because here the consumer is having a good combination of both the commodities given to a budget constraint. So, this Q point would be considered to be the point of consumer equilibrium. Next, we have this revealed preference theory, and revealed preference theory is again based on the assumptions of completeness and transitivity as well as non-satiation, and this theory is given by Samuelson, and this theory is more real and more practical as compared to the previous two theories which we have talked about, cardinal as well as ordinal concept given by Marshall, Allen and Higgs, right. So, this theory says that it is much easier for the people to make their choices and to understand their behavior, how people are behaving, how they are reacting with the choice of any commodity. With this graph you can understand it more clearly, right, where we have seen that consumer know their preferences and they have disclosed their preferences, whatever may be the situation, that if they are preferring product A over B and B over C, they are going to prefer always A over C. So, here we have this money for good X and good Y, and this revealed preference theory also include the principle of demand, where we says that whenever the price of any commodity increases, its demand decreases, and this happens because of the substitutes available, right. People will shift their demand from the use of one commodity to the another commodity. So, here you can see the different combinations which a person can make for the consumption of a commodity while revealing their preferences. So, that is all for this session today. If we are reviewing our session for today, we have talked about the consumer choices, then we have seen this utility concept of cardinal and ordinal, how we can measure the utility, right, given to the consumer income, how we can plan out our budget and where we would be able to reach our equilibrium point, right, so that we can have a better combination of the commodities where you could be able to satisfy your needs and wants to the maximum, right. And lastly, we have talked about the revealed preference theory, which is giving you a real and more practical implication of the utility concept as compared to the cardinal and ordinal utility, where a consumer is indifferent and clear and revealing their preferences in advance, what choices and how they are going to make their choices irrespective of their income and prices, right. So, further I can say that these are the reference books you can go ahead with for this subject, for the subject matter taken for this lecture. These are the reference book, and that is all for today's lecture. Thank you all of you.